And it's difficult times, so we really do thank everybody for being here very early. We figure if it was at a later time, we'd probably have a larger group of people, but this is very good excellence. And as you know, this activity today is really the result of the work of two groups of organizations. One is Marxism-Leninism Today, which is an organization, and also they have an excellent webpage for many years on Marxism-Leninism. And the other one is the Party of Communists USA. And I guess as you already know the rule, that's why you're here. The four speakers will be Greg, Mr. Zighetti. We will also have, who is from Marxism-Leninism Today. We also have Joe Jameson from Marxism-Leninism Today. We have Grover Furr, who is a professor and a writer of many books. Grover has history, right? And we have Angelo D'Angelo from the Party of Communists USA. So I believe, Greg, that you will be the first speaker, so please take over.
Can we have a little 2 minutes by our author friend who?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to say I have a new book out called The Plot to Scapegoat Russia. It's against all this anti-Russia hysteria that's being pushed. And I think folks will enjoy it. It also talks about the new Cold War and the old Cold War as well, and how it's being revived. And anyways, I have copies here for sale as well.
How much?
15, 20 bucks, whatever, you know, you got it. Okay, and I'd love to sign it for you too.
Oh, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I told Greg you could put it on the table.
Okay, great, thank you.
Greg, do you want to sit here or
Yeah.
you want to speak from here?
No, I'll sit.
Want to
No,
sit down?
right, yeah, I'll sit next to Angelo, so
Get good
if
feeding.
I get out of line, I'll correctly. Well, we're making plugs. I was going to plug you, Dan, but you stole the show. I want to plug another author here that you should all be familiar with, and that's, of course, Grover Furr. And he has currently available, I think, at your table.
Yes, some of it at our table.
That's often Stalin, Trotsky's Amalgams, Khrushchev Live, which I think was one of the first things I read. It's quite influential. Blood Lies, which goes after Timothy Snyder, and it's certainly well deserved because he's one of the leaders of the anti-communist crusade today, and The Murder of Kirov. So you'll also sign books, correct?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'll be out there later on.
Okay.
The language of your choice. So many
Thank you,
translations.
Johnny.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very good. So let's talk about the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. Every thoughtful person must recognize that the Bolshevik seizure of power proved to be the most significant and influential event of the 20th century. Despite the demise of the Soviet Union in our time, the revolution and its legacy remain a beacon, a source of inspiration for all those experiencing injustice, harsh rule, and the cruelty brought by capitalism and its masses. 100 years after the Russian Revolution, we can recollect the event in many ways. I would like to focus on two perspectives I believe are especially significant. First, I want to discuss the Bolshevik Revolution as an inspiration to working people, as a tangible experience demonstrating the potential of the working class taking power as more than a mere vision or specter of socialism. Second, I propose that even after 100 years, there's much, very much, we can draw from the Bolshevik Revolution to guide our struggles today. Moreover, some of those ideas may well challenge some of our own entrenched concepts of the road to socialism as we enter the 21st century. I argue that the Russian Revolution is a roadmap, not necessarily the only roadmap, but a proven roadmap for the 21st century socialist revolution. We can't hear him?
You can talk louder. I'm right here next to her.
Sorry, no, I'll try to talk louder. Is there a
If
mic?
you want, if you want to keep on going, and I'll try to see if the IT person maybe can help us.
Maybe if I sit over there on the front.
Maybe you sit in front, there's seats here, and it's sort of unbalanced, the room's kind of unbalanced, so those in the back. Because I do have a rather soft voice if you can't hear me.
I can hear perfect.
Okay?
Thank you.
Sure. As early as 1915, when other Marxists were drawn into the mire of World War I, most of his counterparts were caught between patriotic collaboration and anti-war pacifism, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, saw great opportunity. Here I'm quoting Lenin. All the objective conditions of recent times have put the proletariat's revolutionary mass struggle on the order of the day. It's the duty of socialists, while making use of every means of the working class's legal struggle, to subordinate each and every of those means to this immediate and most important task. Develop the workers' revolutionary consciousness. Rally them in the international revolutionary struggle. Promote and encourage any revolutionary action. And most importantly, and do everything possible to turn the imperialist war between the peoples into a civil war of the oppressed classes against the oppressors. A war for the expropriation of the class of capitalists, for the conquest of political power, of the proletariat, and the realization of socialism. So this is in 1915. This is when many of the socialists who kind of come around to opposing the war were pacifistic. And Lenin says we need more than just pacifism at this stage. He was pushing the envelope in this sense. With power assumed in March of 1917 by a provisional government, the popular organizations, the Soviets, stood aside from governance. The provisional government was awarded time to meet the immediate demands of the people for peace, land, and bread. Upon his return to Russia in April, Lenin recognized both the indecisive character of the provisional government, its distance from the people, and the hunger for change among the people. It was not his way to buy time. It was not his way to watch passively as the revolutionary wind subsided. Instead, he defended his theses at the Party Congress, arguing against any appeasement, any temporizing with the provisional government, pounded away at the demands for peace, for investing all power in the Soviets, for confiscation of land and estates, placed control of the bank, production, and distribution in the hands of the Soviets. The Bolsheviks, Lenin insisted, were to press forward. And press forward they did, winning state power 6 months later. The years following the seizure of power were difficult ones. A revolution is not a mere event, but a process. That process involves creating new institutions and new pathways to a goal never before achieved. It must be remembered that there was no blueprint for socialism. The Bolsheviks were working with a veritable blank slate. This is the task that Lenin and his party set out to tackle. At the same time, the Bolsheviks were faced with a civil war encouraged and materially supported by both the Entente and the Central Powers. It is said that as many as 14 powers invaded Soviet Russia during that period. When the Civil War was over in 1921, Russia was a country in ruin with its economy in shambles, generating only 1/7 of the pre-war output. There had been 14.5 million deaths in the prior 6 years. The victory demonstrated that the Russian people were exhausted. They were solidly in support of the people's government and the project of building socialism. No less of a commitment would have delivered the victory to those most eager to restore capitalism. Soviet leaders understood that imperialism would never concede the existence of a stable, independent workers' state. The leaders understood that the effort to restore capitalism was an unrelenting priority of the elites in Berlin, in London, in Paris, in Washington, and other centers of power. According to the Soviets, devoted every resource and worked feverishly over the following 2 decades to build the industrial and military might of the USSR. The period was one of unprecedented growth. By unleashing the creativity, the discipline, the enthusiasm of the Soviet peoples, industrial production in 1940 was 750% of that in 1930. And of course, remember, it was 1/7 of what it was in 1913 after the Civil War. By 1937, power generation increased 18-fold from 1913. Oil production had nearly tripled, and coal and steel production had increased 4 times. The Soviet Union had grown into an industrial power. While the Russian Revolution began with insurrection in 1917, we can say that it was completed with the socialization of productive forces and the elimination of systemic exploitation by the late 1930s. As a consequence, it was able to become a mighty industrial power with the means to ward off imperialist predation. As we all know, it was soon called upon to do so against the greatest force ever assembled to invade another country. As Mikhail Kalinin said, chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, said on May Day of 1938, "We are not a land flowing with milk and honey. We're a workers' state. Our state started from a beggarly existence. Perhaps we are making many mistakes. This is possible. Perhaps sometimes we are not doing what we ought to do. This is also possible. But I would like to tell you one thing. We are building a proletarian world. Today, there are many who want to diminish the achievements of the Soviet Union. They count on time eroding the truth about the era ushered in by the Bolshevik Revolution. They do all they can to distort or hide that history. They do not want working people to imagine that a world without capitalist exploitation is possible. They do not want working people to believe they can govern without relying upon elites. They do not want to give credence to the idea that public ownership can be rational, efficient, and release the creativity and motivation of working people. They do not want to raise the possibility that a planned economy can eliminate the irrationalities, the waste, inequities, and imbalances of capitalist anarchy. They demean the fraternal aid that Soviets gave to workers' organizations and parties worldwide. They refuse to regard the Soviet doctrine of non-interference in the affairs of others and respect the rights of self-determination as developed by Lenin. They fear the Soviet example of internationalism, a consistent commitment to those in struggle, from Republican Spain to anti-apartheid South Africa. They want to minimize the decisive role of the Soviet Union in the defeat of fascism. They demean the liberation of Eastern and Central Europe from the grip of fascism and the purging of fascism from the political life of these countries. They adamantly refuse to acknowledge the critical part the first socialist country played in the erasure of colonialism from the world and the principal fight against its modern incarnation, neocolonialism. They deny the peace initiative begun by the Soviet Union at the onset of the Cold War. They deny the selfless aid extended by the Soviet Union to developing countries. In short, they discount both the great achievements of Soviet power and the enormous sacrifices made by the Soviet peoples, achievements and sacrifices that shaped the 20th century. I'm going to talk a minute, for some minutes, about the relevance today after I take a swig. And I think some of this may be provocative, I hope it is, and provoke some discussion. But what of its relevance today? Of course, the meaning of the Leninist road to socialism has been contested often, and by many it's contested today. During most of my life, the road to socialism has been envisioned by many in Europe and North America as a peaceful parliamentary process often accomplished through coalitions and in discrete stages. Communist and workers' parties, of course, recognized that ruling classes would likely resist ruthlessly, but many saw a broad anti-monopoly coalition or People's Front as a bulwark against violent reaction. They saw its breadth as some insurance against failure. Unfortunately, history has cast a long shadow over that prospect. No gradualist parliamentary process has transitioned to socialism. Instead, wars, political and economic crises have so far served as the fertile soil for a revolutionary party to lead the masses towards the grasping of political power. They appear, that is, wars, economic crises, and so forth, appear to be the necessary conditions for qualitative transformation. Though they have differed in many respects, anti-capitalist revolutions have importantly resembled the pattern of the 1905 Bolshevik dress rehearsal and the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. That is the reality, simply stated. So why have many Marxists and their friends turned away from the Bolshevik example? Have our times changed so dramatically that it is irrelevant today? I believe the answer lies, in part, with the peculiar character of the period between the First and Second World Wars, especially in Europe. If anything characterizes that period is the rise of fascism and the threat of fascism in the midst of a severe global economic crisis. In many cases, the crisis stimulated the growth and mass influence of revolutionary socialist and workers' parties as well. Fascism as an historical phenomenon arises precisely as an answer to seemingly intractable threats facing bourgeois rule. When those threats reach a critical point, ruling classes cast off the facade and the carefully fostered illusions of democracy and choose the route of naked dictatorial rule. In response, the Marxist-Leninist movement chose a counter-tactic, the approach of a popular front or a people's front against fascism. Communist and workers' parties sought to unite all healthy forces, all popular sectors of society not infected with the fascist ideology, into a block against fascism for the express purpose of warding off fascism or defeating it. The tactic was meant as a temporary answer to an historically contingent, unique moment, when violently anti-communist reaction threatened to dominate many countries and undermine the first and only worker state. If anyone needed proof of the fascist agenda, it came to the Anti-Comintern Pact, first introduced in November of 1936 and signed by all of the fascist nations. At the core of the People's Front and offering its leadership, revolutionaries formed alliances, united fronts against fascism with other workers' organizations and parties. While the tactic failed to decisively turn back fascism or stave off a world war, it drew many to the anti-fascist cause and to communist parties or their parties' orbits. Continuing the United Front tactics into the World War II resistance and supporting efforts, the Marxist-Leninist left duly impressed millions with its selflessness, its sacrifice, and its devotion to defeating fascism. Communist and workers' parties were rewarded with substantial increases in members and followers during and after the war. But unlike the decisions taken by the Bolsheviks and other left-wing socialists in the closing days of the aftermath of World War I, most communist parties chose not to, quoting Lenin, turn the world war into a civil war of the oppressed classes against the repressors. They chose not to seriously test the revolutionary waters, as Lenin urged in 1915. They chose not to risk their growing mass support with a direct challenge to capitalism. Instead, most chose a path of continuing the United Front tactics in a parliamentary form. They proposed paths to socialism that sought parliamentary, multi-party, sometimes multi-class coalitions or alliances that would lead to socialism in discrete steps of advance, consolidate. Though the tactics saw impressive electoral gains in the early decades after the war, stagnation unfolded in the 70s. Parties became less an organ of the working class and more an advocate for immediate reforms. Compromise and collaboration became the watchwords. Consolidation continued, but with no advances. Today, many of the formerly mass communist parties are dramatically weaker, even irrelevant. Moreover, there's a growing gap between many parties and an emerging, unfocused anger of the working class. Some would say the conditions were not ripe after the war for replication of the Bolshevik Revolution. Others may say the workers were divided and the workers were exhausted from war. Perhaps these objections have some merit, but the plain fact is that a continuation of the Popular Front, the United Front against fascism, as a strategic road to socialism, failed. Certainly where communists won local and regional offices in Italy's Red Belt, many French cities, and other European centers, they served as exemplary public servants, free of corruption, responsible to the citizens, and dedicated to civic improvements. They stood apart from bourgeois politicians in these respects. Communist parties energized the labor movements and rallied millions against imperialism. But socialism was neither achieved or brought closer in Europe or North America through the Popular Front strategy. The sobering reality of little progress towards the goals of socialism should cause Marxists and their friends to ponder the road ahead. A few years ago, the work of Thomas Piketty on inequality produced a moment of clarity and a renewed debate on economic justice. Certainly his highly publicized findings provoked wide and intense discussion, but the most important feature of his study was missed by many. An historic trend of capitalist inequality, the historic trend of capitalist inequality contained a detour. Like Marx, Piketty took a long view, an exceedingly long view, which showed that the interwar period, World War II, and the period roughly 30 years after represented a deviant period in the march of inequality. The period after the war, in particular, represented a time of a relative equality, a time when capitalism showed a warmer, fuzzier side. Other social scientists have suggested this as well, but none have demonstrated it so convincingly as Piketty. Europeans have characterized this period as the 30 glorious years, the 30 years after World War II, when European growth and development was restored and people's standard of living was growing relatively rapidly. My own view is that this period of a softer capitalism represented a kind of Cold War insurance premium on the part of ruling classes frightened by the rise of communism, a kind of bargain to exchange class peace for Cold War collaboration. But that discussion takes us further afield. The important point is that this historically aberrant period, this detour, coincides with the adoption of the Popular Front strategy as a road to socialism. With class struggle dampened by the welfare state and a measure of capitalist moderation and stability, the incremental multi-party multi-class approach might plausibly appear appealing to many during that era, including European and North American capitalists, communists. In any event, that era is over. Since the 1970s, capitalism has resumed its rapacious course, squeezing every drop of surplus value from the global working class. The rate of exploitation has increased and continues to increase dramatically, with capitalism shifting swiftly to new, cheaper labor markets. Capitalism leaves lower living standards, poverty, and desperation in the wake of these shifts. Some perceive the emergence of unfettered predatory capitalism as the birth of a new era, the period of neoliberalism. This is somewhat misleading. Piketty's profound study shows that unfettered predatory capitalism is, in fact, the normal trajectory, the regular course of capitalist accumulation. That's its history. And that period, this glorious 30 years, with a detour. Today, capitalism is back on course. It's immiserating workers on every continent, creating an enormous gulf between the lives of the bourgeoisie and the working people, and suffocating any hope for a better future for the masses. Competition has driven living standards down and slashed and burned whole towns and cities as entire enterprises have moved from place to place in pursuit of lower costs and public incentives. Public works crumble or are privatized, and culture is debased. Austerity is the cry that justifies the rending of all government safety nets. Wars continue endlessly and erupt like dry kindling. Shifting alliances further destabilize international relations. The fight for markets intensifies, and its intensity promises even further conflicts. Fear-inducing demons are conjured to escalate the arms race. The institutions of capitalism are in deep crisis, with opinion polls showing that few trust or have confidence in them. Participation in political institutions is declining, and the dominant parties are discredited. Voters vote for the new and a desperate hope that change will emerge. The security agencies are more and more repressive and racist, and the courts are corrupt and arbitrary. The instruments of consent, the capitalist media, the educational institutions, the entertainment industry are in disrepute. Fewer and fewer people trust the news or the pundits. More and more people are turning towards alternative media. And the global economy is in the worst crisis since the Great Depression. Periods of stagnation are followed by further seismic jolts that trap capitalism on the road to nowhere. In the context of this multifaceted, deepening global crisis, the tactics of the post-war period appear to be more and more ineffective. Continuing dysfunction of capitalism places the goal of socialism much closer. The anger and despair that are increasingly visible with the masses are surely symptoms of a deep-seated dissatisfaction with the current system. While the pitchforks are not yet coming out, there are good reasons to suspect that many people are beginning to look for the pitchforks. They are more and more in need of a revolutionary party for socialism. I conclude by emphatically restating that with Leninism, we have a proven road to socialism, the advance of the angry, dissatisfied masses towards social revolution. With Leninism, we have a persistent yet patient educating and agitating of the working class to equip the class for such a struggle. We have the preparation for the moment when conditions ripen and need only a stroke from a revolutionary party to burst open with the prospect of socialist revolution. While Lenin endorsed the parliamentary fight, he endorsed it as a forum for the fomenting of revolutionary ideas and the discrediting of capitalism. He consistently employed every tool made available by the bourgeoisie, but only to advance towards smashing the capitalist state and constructing socialism. To quote Rosa Luxemburg's apt words, "He who tries to apply the homemade wisdom derived from parliamentary battles between frogs and mice to the field of revolutionary tactics only shows thereby that the very psychology and laws of existence of revolution are alien to him, and that all historical experiences to him a book sealed with 7 seals." 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, I believe it's the lessons of Lenin to which we must return.
Thank you very much, Greg Zoltan Zaghetti, also from
It's
the
pronounced Zaghetti.
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 from
Thank
the
you.
website Marxism, Leninism Today, which is a website which is not only on the history an analysis of the past, but also has contemporary articles on Venezuela, the struggles in this country and around the world. Our next speaker is D'Angelo from the Party of Communists.
No.
Oh, I'm a mistake, I'm sorry.
I'm next.
Grover first next. Oh, I don't know what I did.
I looked at you like.
In shock.
Could you pass that back to the gentleman in the back row, please? I think you need one too. This is my handout if you don't have a handout.
And right this, man.
Does everybody have my handout here? No? Maybe Tony or somebody could, maybe Joe, give us one each to everybody. Did you get? My thanks to ML today and my thanks to ML today and the Party of Communist USA for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to address the question of the Soviet Union during the years of Stalin's leadership, Joseph Stalin's leadership. I'll start by asking rhetorically, quote, why doesn't everybody on the left celebrate the achievements of the Russian Revolution as they were carried out during what we may call the Stalin period? Change glasses. See better. Today we know from primary source evidence that all the allegations of crimes, atrocities, mass murders, and other horrors attributed to Joseph Stalin are lies. We also know that everything that Leon Trotsky wrote after December 1934 about Stalin, the Moscow trials, the Soviet Union, and his own activities was deliberately false. Lies again. 10 years ago, I could not have made these statements. Now I can. They have been proven by primary source evidence, mainly from the former Soviet archives and from the Trotsky Archive at Harvard University. This means that the history of the Soviet Union that we have been taught, that is embodied in all the books by anti-communist bourgeois historians and by Trotskyist writers, is all false. It's the proverbial tissue of lies. What I may call the canonical or mainstream history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, as well as the Trotskyist version of that history, is not merely wrong in its details, but is fundamentally wrong. The result, to paraphrase Weird Al Yankovic, one of my favorite singers, quote, everything you think you know about the history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period is wrong. The history of the Soviet Union during the period of Stalin's leadership must be completely rewritten. But very few people know this. Most people on the left continue to believe a demonized and falsified version of Soviet history and of Stalin's role in it that constitutes the canonical or mainstream version. Most influential on the left is the Trotskyist version of Soviet history of the 1920s and 30s. This version is either taken straight from Trotsky's own writings or from the writings of Trotskyist authors who follow Trotsky's version of history. There is no attempt to check Trotsky's fact claims against the evidence now available. Trotskyist writers and those influenced by Trotskyism simply assumed that Trotsky was telling the truth. This is all the easier to do because many overtly anti-communist historians have used Trotsky's writings for decades. Trotsky's attacks on Stalin have been convenient to anti-communist historical propaganda. And the converse is also true. Trotskyist writers rely heavily on openly pro-capitalist anti-communist historians whenever their fact claims and interpretations appear to be consistent with the Trotskyist version. Consider the very recent book October by China Mieville, a popular British writer of fantasy fiction and comic books. Mieville claims to have done a lot of research on the Bolshevik Revolution. This book just came out.
Yeah, I did.
In reality, he has done no research on the revolution or on Soviet history. He has simply read a lot of books. Those he identifies in October are either of the mainstream anti-communist school or of the Trotskyist school. Mieville is a prisoner of the sources he has chosen to believe. Here are a few quotations from Mieville's book, October. These are quotations from Mieville. Stalin, of course, was not yet Stalin at the time of the revolution. Today, any account of the revolution is haunted by a ghost from the future, the twinkly-eyed, mustachioed monstrosity, Uncle Joe, the butcher, keen architect of a grotesque and crushing despotic state. Hey, that's the Soviet Union. The ism that bears his name. There have been decades of debate about the etiology of Stalinism. That means what's called Volumes of stories about the man's brutality and that of his regime. They cast shadows backwards from what was to come. A capable, if never scintillating organizer, at best an adequate intellectual, at worst an embarrassing one. Lenin's health is failing. He suffers strokes in 1922 and 23 and struggles in what has been called his final fight against the bureaucratic tendencies, the ossification and corruption he sees growing. He grows suspicions of Stalin's personality and his place within the machine. In his last writings, he insists Stalin must be removed from his post as general secretary. Stalinism, a police state of paranoia, cruelty, murder, and kitsch. End quote. This is all utterly false.
Cartoon.
As false as it would be to say the same things about Lenin. Where did Mieville get this nonsense? From Trotsky. Trotskyist works, and works by pro-capitalist anti-communists. He says this about Trotsky's history. Leon Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, 1930, justly celebrated as a towering, vivid, historically vital work. That's Mieville. He recommends books by Trotskyists Barbara Allen, Kevin Murphy, David King, and Tony Cliff, and the incompetent, dishonest biography by Isaac Deutscher. Mieville also recommends some non-Trotskyist works. All of these are terrible, dishonest, incompetent anti-communist works. He says this about Orlando Feige's book, A People's Tragedy. This is what Mieville says about A People's Tragedy. Exhaustive in scope and research, written with elan and stuffed with anecdotes that make for compelling reading. This is not necessary. In reality, that's the end of the quotation. In reality, Feige's lies and even falsifies his footnoted sources, bending everything to his anti-communist purposes. But of course, you have to go out and check this stuff to see if that's true, which I did. Mieville recommends 3 books in all by Feiges. Mieville conveys the anti-communist and Trotskyist versions of Soviet history. Having done no research himself, he passes on to readers the biases of others, which he then hugs to his own breast. Garbage in, garbage out. The result is that Mieville's Trotskyist slander of Stalin is so agreeable to capitalist anti-communist versions that on May 7th of this year, the New York Times published an article by Mieville in which he summarizes his own Trotskyist and supposedly revolutionary viewpoint. This is the title of the article. The New York Times refused to publish several letters to the editor, mine included, that criticized Mieville's article. The previous day, May 6th, The Guardian of London published an article by Mieville entitled, Why Does the Russian Revolution Matter? So the mainstream capitalist media is not only open, but even friendly to Trotskyists as it is to mainstream anti-communists, while it is closed to the truth. No surprise there. This has all happened before. During the 1930s, Trotsky himself published viciously anti-Stalin articles in dozens of capitalist newspapers and magazines in Europe, and of course in the New York Times as well. Emma Goldman, an anti-communist anarchist, also published widely in the capitalist press. At least Goldman reportedly wondered about this because she knew the capitalist press published her because of her fervent anti-communism and criticism of the Soviet Union, not out of any sympathy with her own anarchist views. There's a good chance that Mieville's October will be widely read by young people because of his popularity as a fantasy and comic writer and his reputation as an activist and radical. His readers have no way of knowing that Mieville is just recycling Trotskyist and anti-communist lies. In the years before the Bolshevik Revolution, the leaders of the various Russian socialist parties read and commented, often very critically, on each other's works. They also read and critiqued the works of German socialist writers. But today's Trotskyist writers do not do this. And indeed, they do not even use the work of Trotskyist historians. This adds detail and texture to the case that Trotsky lied consistently. No, that was 3. A case in point. Case in point is that of Pierre Brouet, Trotskyist historian. During the 1980s and 90s, Brouet, the most famous Trotskyist historian of his time, discovered and published about a number of examples of lies and falsehoods in Trotsky's writings in the 1930s. Right? That's Brouet, Trotskyist historian, who discovered various lies and falsehoods in Trotsky's writings. But Brouet never followed up on what these lies of Trotsky's imply, even though he himself had discovered them. He ignored them when writing his biography of Trotsky in 1987 and his subsequent books. In his last book, Communiste contre Stalin, which means Communist against Stalin, 2003, he does not even mention them. In reality, and there is some evidence that Brouet realized this, if only dimly, Trotsky's lies changed completely our understanding of Trotsky's political activities and writings of the 1930s. For example, Brouet discovered and published in 1980 the evidence that a bloc of rights and Trotskyites did in fact exist in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Brouet's discoveries correspond exactly to what was said about this bloc in the Moscow trials of 1936, 37, and 38. The existence of this bloc proves that Trotsky and his son Leon Sedov lied in their Red Book on the Moscow trial, October 1936. It also proved that Trotsky lied over and over again to the Dewey Commission in 1937. Yet in his own article on the Dewey Commission, Brouet continues to uphold the conventional Trotskyist view that it disproves the charges made against by Trotsky in the first and second Moscow trials, and continues to claim, as Trotskyists and pro-capitalist anti-communists do to the present day, that the Red Book and the Dewey Commission disproved the charges made against Trotsky at the Moscow trial and proved that Trotsky was, quote, not guilty. In reality, if the members of the Dewey Commission, all of them anti-communists, had known that Trotsky was lying to them, or had known that Trotsky really had given his approval to the formation of an underground bloc of rights of Trotskyites inside the Soviet Union, they would never have found Trotsky not guilty. I go into all of this in my book, Trotsky's Amalgam. In his books and articles, Brouet carefully avoided exploring the significance of his own discoveries of this and other lies of Trotsky's. Brouet also ignored the discovery by American historian Arch Getty, and that Trotsky had in fact secretly written to some of his former supporters inside the Soviet Union. So Brouet's and Getty's discoveries of just a few of Trotsky's lies overturned both the Trotskyist and the conventional anti-communist accusation that the charges against Trotsky at the Moscow trials were frame-ups. However, not only did Brouet himself ignore this fact when writing about Trotsky in the Moscow trials, all Trotskyist and anti-communist writers ignored and continue to ignore these discoveries of Brouet's. Meanwhile, inspired by Brouet's and Getty's discoveries of the 1980s, and with the help of documents from former Soviet archives, I have discovered many more lies by Trotsky. This adds detail and texture to the case that Trotsky lied consistently during the 1930s in all his writings about Stalin and the Soviet Union. Yet on one of the panels at the Left Forum this year is entitled, quote, Trotsky's Biography of Stalin, Reconstructing a Masterpiece. That's really the name. The panelists are Trotskyists and represent a British Trotskyist publisher that has published a new edition of Trotsky's dishonest biography of Stalin. This, Trotsky's Biography of Stalin, is a book where Trotsky calls Stalin an Asiatic, citing as evidence a book by a Georgian Nazi. Brouet's example proves that Trotskyists pay no attention even to the research of other Trotskyists, when that research threatens the conventional Trotskyist view of history to which they are loyal. This is called confirmation bias, defined as, quote, the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. That's Wikipedia. It is a systematic error of inductive reasoning, a kind of logical fallacy. It is universal among Trotskyists and anti-communists. It is the opposite of objectivity. Materialists of any kind, and of course Marxists, are supposed to base their conclusions on evidence. To do otherwise is not materialism, but idealism. This means that insofar as a person is a Trotskyist, he or she is not a materialist, and therefore not a Marxist at all. Trotskyists claim to be both communists and Marxists, yet they simply believe what Trotsky wrote. This is not materialism, this is a cult. Trotskyist historians are welcomed by mainstream anti-communist historians. The works of Vadim Rogovin are widely quoted by inveterate anti-communist historians. The adherents of an irrational cult, Trotskyists can and do find employment as professors of Soviet history and publish in academic journals and with academic publishers. When Pierre Brouet died in 2006, 5, something like that, Bernard Bayerlein, a ferociously anti-communist and anti-Stalinist historian in Germany, wrote him an appreciative obituary. They had worked together. I will beg the patience of those of you who are familiar with my research while I briefly summarize a few of the results of my study of the accusations leveled by Leon Trotsky, pro-capitalist anti-communist, Khrushchev and Gorbachev, against Stalin. All are false. 1. The lie that at the end of his life, Lenin was trying to get Stalin out of the position of general secretary. And Lenin last struck. That's a lie. This was believed at the time, when the documents were made known to the party leadership in the 1920s after Lenin's death. But thanks to careful research by Valentin Sakharov of Moscow State University, even mainstream researchers know that this note, like Lenin's testament, is probably a forgery. Stephen Kotkin, in his recent biography of Lenin up to 1928, accepts Sakharov's analysis. It is likely that Lenin's testament was faked by Lenin's wife Krupskaya, probably in collusion with Trotsky. And Kotkin, who accepts this, is ferocious anti-communist. Point. Collectivization of agriculture was a success. Russia and Ukraine had suffered serious famines every few years for more than a millennium. A famine accompanied the 1917 revolution, growing more serious in 1918 to 1920. Another serious famine, misnamed the Volga famine, struck from 1920 to 21. There were famines in 1924 and again in 1928-29. This last one especially severe in the Ukrainian SSR. All these famines had environmental causes. The medieval strip farming method of peasant agriculture made efficient agriculture impossible and famines inevitable. Soviet leaders, Stalin among them, decided that the only solution was to reorganize agriculture on the basis of large factory-type farms like some in the American Midwest, which were deliberately adopted as models. And Sovkhozy, or Soviet farms, appeared to work well. The Soviet leadership made the decision to amplify that. Contrary to anti-communist propaganda, most peasants accepted collectivization. Resistance was modest, acts of outright rebellion rare. By 1932, Soviet agriculture, including in Ukraine, was largely collectivized. In reality, therefore, the Soviet collectivization of agriculture is one of the greatest feats of social reform in the 20th century, if not the greatest of all, ranking with the Green Revolution, Miracle Rice, and the water-controlled undertakings in China and the United States. If Nobel Prizes were rewarded for communist achievements, Soviet collectivization would be a top contender. Point. The famine of 1932-33 was neither caused by collectivization nor deliberately manipulated to kill Ukrainians. If you are interested in the scholarship on the famine, I suggest you read my 2 articles in March issues of Counterpunch. Point. A bloc of rights and Trotskyites really did exist. They did conspire to kill Sergei Kirov, party leader in Leningrad, and also to kill Stalin and other Bolshevik leaders. Point. Zinoviev and Kamenev were members of this bloc, as they confessed at the 1936 Moscow trial. Point. Yuri Pyatakov did meet secretly with Trotsky in December 1935 in Norway, as he claimed at the second Moscow trial. Point. Nikolai Bukharin was guilty of at least the crimes to which he confessed at the third Moscow trial of March 1938. Point. According to all the evidence now available, all the defendants at the 3 Moscow trials were guilty of at least the crimes they confessed to. I have examined in detail the evidence concerning the Moscow trials in the first 12 chapters of my book, Trotsky's Amalgams. Point. Stalin struggled hard to democratize the Soviet Union by bringing back, quote, all power to the Soviets in the 1936 Constitution. Stalin wanted contested elections and to get the Communist Party out of the business of running all aspects of society. But Stalin failed even to win a majority in the Politburo. This is one of the many examples that prove that, you ready for this? Stalin was not a dictator. Trotskyists and anti-communists falsely claim that he was. When I published a long article on this subject, Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform, back in 2005, the leading American Trotskyist intellectual wrote to the journal that published my article to tell them that they should never have published it. When the editors offered to publish an article criticizing mine, he refused to write one. Point. The Tukhachevsky affair. Military commanders did conspire with Germany and Japan to overthrow the Soviet government and ally with the Axis. Point. The so-called Great Terror was a conspiracy by oppositionists to overthrow the Stalin leadership and unite the Soviet Union with fascist Germany and militarist Japan. Stalin and his supporters stopped the Great Terror and arrested, tried, and executed those responsible. Point. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was necessitated by Britain's and France's sellout of Czechoslovakia to Hitler at Munich, and Poland's and Hungary's participation in this sellout, and their refusal to agree to a mutual defense treaty against Hitler's Germany. Clearly, Britain and France were encouraging Hitler to attack the Soviet Union. Point. Trotsky was not only conniving with other Soviet oppositionists to murder Stalin and other Soviet leaders, but also plotting with the Germans, Japanese, English, and French to overthrow the Soviet government in time of war. We have a great deal of evidence on this issue. In the fall of this year, 2017, I will publish the second book in my projected trilogy on Trotsky. It will be titled Trotsky's Conspiracies. A third volume to be published in 2019 will cite yet more evidence. Point. The Soviets did not kill the 14,000 or so Polish prisoners in the so-called Katyn massacres. In March of next year, 2018, I will publish my study of the evidence in the Katyn case. There can be no doubt that the Nazis and Ukrainian anti-communist government, Polish anti-communist government in exile collaborated to frame the Soviets, that is, Stalin. What to do? We need to publicize as wide as possible the knowledge that the Trotskyist version of Soviet history is false. We need to publicize the fact about Trotsky's lies, the evidence that everything Trotsky wrote about Stalin or the Soviet Union after December 1935 is false, Trotsky's disinformation in order to conceal his conspiracies against the Soviet state and the Stalin leadership. We need a new history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, the period that is most slandered and lied about by the Trotskyists and professional anti-communists. This is a vital task and it has not yet begun. On the basis of historical truth, we need to discover what the Soviets did that was correct, worthy of imitation, and also what they did that was incorrect, mistaken. Because the Soviet Union did fail to build communism, as Lenin, Stalin, and so many others had wanted, and ultimately reverted to predatory capitalism. We need to find out why this happened. To do that, we must base our analysis on what really did happen, not on the lies spread by Trotsky, Trotskyists, and the overt pro-capitalist anti-communists. Thank you.
Two more speakers. I believe that will take a little bit less time, so we will have enough time, more than enough time for questions and answers and debates. And so our next speaker will be Angelo D'Angelo from the Party of Communists, USA.
Thank you. I would like to sit here, I don't know if you all could hear me. 32 years teaching in public school system. I have a loud voice because of getting all the children together, you know, when you're teaching a lesson. I want to first mention U.S. Friends of the Soviet People, which no one mentioned yet. It's an important organization, I really believe this. There are other groups in Canada and in Australia and in other places that form the same thing. We were formed in 1992. It started with two individuals, George, me, and then we got Lois, who's passed, Lois Singer. And that group was detrimental in my involvement in the Communist Party USA. I was told by the leadership of the party at the time, 1993, to stop doing pro-Soviet work, since there is no more Soviet Union. But I mentioned there's such a thing as people who lived under the Soviet Union, Soviet people. So I wanted to mention that organization. It's an important stepping stone to what we're talking about today. The issue, I want to also mention that we have in the audience here people who wrote books. It's very shy, but we have Joe and Roger wrote an excellent book. You should get a copy of it. It's called Socialism Betrayed. Please write this down. Socialism Betrayed. Oh, you brought a copy. Great. Okay, it's excellent. It goes into some of the reasons of why what happened in '91 ultimately was happened. Part of this goes back to Khrushchev, goes back to the black market economy, goes to Gorbachev. The other book I want to mention, write this down, is the ambassador from the FDR, ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1936 until '41. It's called Mission to Moscow. I urge people to get that book, Mission to Moscow. It's from the American side, and he explains of the trials in the late 30s in Moscow, why those trials were important. This is the American ambassador, not some communist.
Joseph Davies.
Yeah, Joseph Davies. Thank you, Conrad. Joseph Davies. And a film was made, which U.S. Friends has, called Mission to Moscow, which was done by Warner Brothers in 1940.
Oh my God.
It was done by Warner Brothers in 1940, based on that. It's excellent. In 1952, when the McCarthy period came along, those films, there was 22 of them in a vault, and most of them were destroyed. They kept one or two. This was during the McCarthy period, Hollywood 10 period, that period. But I want to mention this Mission to Moscow, the film is excellent, excellent. I myself have given it to young people in our party who don't know anything about this period. So they show it to their parents, who are even younger than I am. I was just 70. And their parents are younger than me. They would have been my children, and these young kids would have been my grandchildren, age-wise. And they call me up and they tell me, this is fantastic. We didn't even know any of this. It's all hidden history. So I urge people to get the DVD, Mission to Moscow, and read the book by Joseph Davies, Mission to Moscow. It goes into that period about the non-aggression pact. It goes into the reason why we needed a non-aggression pact. And it's written from a non-left source, which I think is important. As far as my talk today is going to be really short. It's the issue of why we need a party. I think we need a party. I think most of us in this room were involved at one point in their lives or another in another political party, or less. Many of us were. And we understand the importance historically of having a party. As Greg said, a revolutionary party that deals with the working class. That is so important. Many of us have made attempts. We're at different stages of doing that. There are people in this room who are involved in different formations of that. We took the step, those of us in U.S. Friends, took the step and later on and to help set up a group called National Council of Communists, which eventually became the Party of Communists. And it's still not a concrete situation, it's still forming. We're hoping that we can have a united front situation where we can get all the people back in one group that have similar ideological worldviews. Basically, it's on Marxism-Leninism. The foundation of our party and of the communist movement is very simple, and it's simple for people who are non-communist to understand. My mother, who was not a communist, said to me, how could it be that they disowned the Soviet Union? Talking about the old communist, some of the communist parties around the world. She said, this is my mother, who's not a communist. She said, the reason why we have communist parties is because they supported the Soviet Union. That was the difference between us and the socialist parties. This is my mother saying this, okay? So, unfortunately, many of the people who used to believe that after the counter-revolution in 1991, their attitude was, we were at the ship sailed, we were at the port, and the ship sailed. The ship of socialism sailed. And we're never going to get it back again. This is the mindset of what my comrade George calls the revisionists in the communist movement, but what I call the renegades. These people tend to feel, we got to grab crumbs now. This is the whole idea. I spoke to these people who used to be comrades of mine. I was a member of the OCP USA for 42 years. So I was involved in New York, in this area. And the attitude they had was, it's gone, let's try to get crumbs. Whatever we can get from the boss, we're lucky. And look what it led to. It led to relying on the Democratic Party. And eventually, you get somebody like Trump, because once you let your ideological gauntlet down, what comes in? Eventually, and historically, Social Democrats, The Lesson of Germany by Gerhard Eisler, a book that was put out by international publishers. Lesson of Germany, you should write this down, excellent. It shows how eventually Social Democrats lead to fascism. It was very interesting. I thought that was interesting, that book. I told George I think we should reprint it in Red Star. Okay, when I think of the Soviet Union, I remember I was there in '76. I was there for a couple of months. Remember, I was already a communist. I was a communist when I was 20. I go to the Soviet Union when 27. It's a whole different mindset when you're already a communist. Now you see what ideologically you heard about in theory, you see it in practice. I walked through the streets of Moscow, and looking up, I remember Kalinin Prask, which is like Kalinin Avenue, these big buildings that were built, and I'm looking and I'm saying, all this without board of directors of capitalists. Walking, and it just impressed me. Walking through a society where the workers have an influence. It's debatable whether they were in direct control, you heard of workers' control, but they had a direct influence in the outcome of that society where we don't have under capitalism. So I thought that was extremely interesting for me. My couple of months there. English was the #1 foreign language in 1976. It was the age of what they call the golden age of Soviet socialism. It was the time of Brezhnev. People introduced me into their homes, strangers, because English was the #1 foreign language. You stand out like a foreigner, like a sore thumb, when this was during the time blue jeans cut off and having cameras. They know you're American or an Englishman right away. And they invited you into their homes, and they were very proud of their material goods. Very proud. This is our radio, this is our TV. We had pants that were flare. Remember we had flare pants? Bell bottoms, right. And they had long hair, like the Beatles, and they were very proud of that. And I remember in Leningrad, they said, come back next year and see we have progressed. How many people in New York tell that to foreigners, visitors? Come back next year and we'll see how New York has progressed. First of all, New York never progresses. It seems to get worse, no matter who you have in the mayorship. But for the working people, it's always bad, no matter what. It's always bad for the working people. Paul Robeson said it best. What did he say? He said when he was in the Soviet Union, for the first time in my life, I felt free, he said. For the first time as a Negro, I felt free, the lack of racism. That says it all. When I went there in '76, I felt like Pilgrim, I came home. There used to be a commercial for coffee, and Pilgrim, your search is ended. I don't know if any of the old timers remember that. It was for some coffee. And that's how I felt when I went there. My search was ended. I saw the future. And I said at the time, if we can have planes of people from Harlem and Appalachia coming to see what socialism is about, that's the way we can recruit. So the Soviet experience as, this is our newspaper, by the way, and the headline is editorial, the October Revolution, a beacon for Americans today. And that's what I think that revolution was for millions of people throughout the world. Remember, there were over 10,000 unemployed Americans who went to the Soviet Union to find jobs during the period of the 30s, of the Depression, because it was a beacon. It was a beacon. And those forces in the left today, I use the word left loosely, look around you, the left forum, they call themselves left, all right? Left of what? Left of Trump. I don't know. Yeah, exactly. And my experience is, as a communist, you have to walk a certain line. I told this to George in our classes. On one side is ultra leftism, which is a dead-end street, goes nowhere. On the other side is opportunism, and that goes nowhere. So we have to walk that certain thing. And the Soviet experience has to be part of a political party that's gearing as a vanguard of the working class. And we can't just use the word vanguard. We actually have to be the vanguard of the working class. We have to be there in the mesh. I was a member of the U of T for God knows how many years. 32 years. 32 years I was a member. And I was the shop steward or equivalent for my school. And everybody knew my politics. This is interesting. I taught in Staten Island, which is a conservative borough. A conservative borough. And everybody knew my politics. They didn't know how left, but they knew I was left. And the conservative teachers came up to me because they saw me as an honest trade unionist, an honest guy, and they wanted to see that. They were tired of the manipulators at the head of the union, at the U of T, the Shankers and people like him. So my principal, little P.S., I was putting union literature in the mailbox, so my principal, at that time I was in Brooklyn, Dyker Heights, she said, "Are you putting communist literature in the mailbox?" And I laughed, because indirectly I was. The caucus I was with, Teachers Action Caucus, was originally started by the Communist Party, you would say. So she was indirectly. What else? I was just interviewed yesterday by what was it?
TBS.
TBS, Turner Broadcasting System.
Samantha Bee.
What?
Samantha Bee.
Oh, I don't know who it was, but there was like 20 people that came here. All of a sudden, they all get around me like I was honey and they were bees. And I was surprised that I got that kind of reaction. And they were very inquisitive. They never really met a communist. Here they are at the left forum, And they never met a communist at the left forum. It was interesting, right?
Few on the ground,
Yeah.
rare on the ground.
Exactly. And our big banner, which they made us take down, by the way, on the wall, was a picture of Lenin, big picture of Lenin, with red rays coming out of it. You've seen the banner, those we had at our Congress. And they were taking pictures of it. They never seen Lenin. A big banner of Lenin in New York City, let alone in the United States. But, and there's a Lenin statue. Thank you. Yes, I saw that one. And there's one in Seattle. There's a big Lenin statue in Seattle, I just found out. A big one. And the people who were involved with, angry because they took down Confederate statues, are now saying, well, what about this statue? Why is that one up, you know? But getting back to my original talk, I do best when I talk like this in the classroom. They love, kids love you to act for them. You know, they don't want to see you reading things. They want to see you, you know, you come in like Lincoln if you're talking about the Civil War, and you dress like things. That's what the kids love. So you're basically, most teachers are frustrated actors. I really believe that. But getting back to the Soviet experience, it's part of our history. It's part of who we are. It's part of our class struggle. It's not separated. And to say that you can build socialism in this country with American characteristics sounds very good as far as words are concerned. But is it separated from the international movement, whether it's Venezuela, or whether it's Cuba, or whether it's Bolivia, or any other country that's struggling to get rid of capitalism and to have a socialist system? And I think a political party, I think everyone in this room should be part of a political party. I've always told young people, it doesn't matter what party you're with, join a political party. Most of them are on the internet. They're in their rooms by themselves, quietly, and they think they're doing revolutionary work. Get away from that internet. Get out to the streets. Set up tables. Talk to people. Be part of the human race. And so my experience in the Soviet Union, I'm going to end up. My experience.
No, I'm not bursting you. That's good.
Yeah, my experience in the Soviet Union was it now gave validity to my ideological viewpoints. Now I saw socialism concrete. I saw it in action. And you know, for the Trotskyites and the Social Democrats and even some other ultra-lefts, for them to criticize what we had in the Soviet Union is amazing. There was a cartoon, I'll never forget it, in one of my best newspapers called The Daily World years ago in the 70s, before you got involved with the paper. But in the 70s, there was a cartoon, I don't know who it was by, there was a guy named Foley who used to be a cartoonist, I think it could have been him. And it shows a soldier, Soviet soldier, a big soldier defending all the little countries of the world who want national liberation. And you see a little roach at the bottom, and he points to the soldier's shoelace. And he said, look, he's jumping up and down, it's untied. That's the typical mindset of these ultra-left and these anti-Soviet forces in the left. They try to magnify something that's not right about the Soviet experience. Let's talk about what was right. Full unemployment, housing for everyone.
Employment.
Employment, I meant to say employment, right, sorry. Yeah, I keep thinking of this
we know what
country.
you meant.
We have full unemployment. We have that here, full unemployment. But it's true, they had a month where you get paid for a vacation in Sochi and other places. Today, by the way, Sochi is all privatized under Putin. But you had free education, you had medical. I mean, you know, those people who lost that look back at it now and they see what they lost. It's unfortunate that at the time the counter-revolution came, they expected. My last sentence, when I was in the Soviet Union, I was in the Moscow synagogue talking to the shamus, anybody who's Yiddish or Jewish. The shamus, he was the person who was in charge of taking care of the synagogue. And there were these two young people there, and I said to them, it's 1975, I was laid off as a teacher. I don't know if anybody knows, Beam and Koch was coming in. They laid off 20,000 teachers in the New York City public school system. 20,000. I was one of them. So I had saved money to go to the Soviet Union, and I stuck my hands in my pocket, and I pulled out empty pockets. And I said, this is the United States. I said, we have one day you have a job, the next day you don't. And these two kids looked at me, they weren't kids, they were in their 20s. They looked at me and they said, how could it be you don't have a job? Their mindset under socialism, they couldn't understand that. How could it be you don't have a job? Everybody has to have a job. Everybody, because under socialism, everybody had a job in the Soviet Union. So they couldn't understand and fathom that. I didn't understand it, and I told them, I says, well, don't you read your newspapers? And I couldn't believe the answer. We don't believe our newspapers. That was the young people telling me. This was in '76. We don't believe our newspapers. So what do they believe? The Western press? Western TV? Who knows? But that was my experience, and the Soviet experience to me changed my whole life. You can see I'm excited now as I was when I was 14. The same exuberance, the same excitement. People say, you're always quiet, but when you talk about the Soviet Union, you come alive. And it's as if it was yesterday I was there. It changed my life, and it changed the lives of all the people who lived in that country and people outside. Remember, Social Security, all these things that we had in Western Europe came because of the Soviet Union. If there was no Soviet Union, we would have had none of those things. And that's it, I finished, thank you.
It's on Houston Street.
It was removed.
It was removed?
That building was sold.
Oh, yeah, they took the one on the Rook Square building, yeah, they took
But
it
they're
down.
supposed to have moved it to another building.
Yeah, it's still down there.
Did you see it?
No, I haven't seen it.
I took a picture of it last year.
Yeah, it was just within the last few months, they took it off the roof.
Oh, good Lord. In any case, it was on Houston Street, so then maybe they did move it.
It's not.
That's a Rook Square.
Oh, okay, so then we will continue. Our next speaker from the website and organization Marxism, Leninism Today, Joe Jameson.
I'll be brief. I can't promise to be as entertaining as the previous speaker, but I want to talk about a little piece of research I'm doing on, we're here today to discuss the Soviet impact, or the Russian Revolution's impact on us. And I think there is an idea that Greg has hit upon. I've listened to his talk a number of times, and the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that he's onto something bigger, and that this notion of that the 20th century was an exceptional period in capitalist history, and which Piketty has documented exhaustively, has a lot of implications, apart from the ones that Greg mentioned. And I want to argue that we tend to understate the impact of the Soviet era on the U.S. And what he's offering is a way of periodizing the 20th century and understanding the 20th century in a different way. Now, if you take a look at, apologies for those rough and ready charts there, but the top chart is from the Piketty book, and it shows that the mid-20th century was an era of declining inequality. In fact, if any of you have seen Robert Reich's, who's a liberal, basically, his book on inequality, his film on inequality, he makes a big point of this. In fact, he portrays it as a suspension bridge, and that somehow the mid-20th century was exceptional. And the question is, why was it exceptional? And I think a major factor in it was, and look at the bottom chart now. The mid-20th century, and by the way, those two charts kind of coincide. It doesn't look like it because the scale, the time scale at the bottom is different. But the period of maximum unionization of the U.S. Was in the mid-20th century. So I believe that the major factor in the mid-20th century advances in the Western working class was the example of the socialist world. Now, in the nature of the case, this is hard to prove, although a few people, as I'll mention in a minute, have tried to argue it. But, and there is evidence, though not conclusive evidence, that something unusual was happening in that mid-20th century. The thing that was happening was that capitalism was more more willing to make concessions to the Western working class than it has been in previous periods and in subsequent periods. So if you consider the decline of inequality in the mid-20th century, and if you consider the rise in trade union organization in the mid-20th century, that coincided with what? What historical force was sufficient to make that happen, to enable that to happen? Now, I think we can see clearly now that it was transient and that it was temporary and that we reverted to the normal barbarity of capitalism. But it surprised me that there are very few studies of this. You can read in various places descriptions of the West German economy, and they would often say, well, you know, there was a third party at the table every time the West German trade unions sat down with the employers. There was the GDR next door, even though the GDR had fewer resources and was operating under more constraints. One of my favorite bourgeois historians of socialism is a Britisher named E.H. Carr, who was an immensely skilled researcher whose politics were not always the best, but who resisted the worst anti-communism of most bourgeois historians. And he wrote a book called The Soviet Impact on the Western World, 1946, and he goes through and he was writing it as the new labor government was coming in and introducing some elements of planning, and he focuses on the ideological, the political, the economic, and social impact of the Soviet example on capitalism in that era.
What's that book called?
The Soviet Impact on the Western World, 1946. I did a quick and dirty literature search. There was a very prominent Soviet theorist named Boris Ponomarev, and he wrote back in 1983, the theoretical and practical contribution of the CPSU as the pioneer of a fundamentally new society is stimulating a worldwide historical movement towards socialism and communism. Having won and safeguarded the key socioeconomic rights and freedoms for their own people, the socialist countries are giving inspiration to the forces of social progress in other countries. It is a fact that the Soviet Union was the first to introduce state social insurance, the first to have a legally fixed 8-hour working day, the first to have paid vacations, the first to have equality of the sexes, first in free medical care and economic planning on a countrywide scale. The guaranteed right to work has become an inseparable feature of the Soviet socialist way of life. These ideas and achievements have been adopted by all supporters of social progress. They make it easier for them to champion economic and social rights and safeguard democratic freedoms that have already been won and to secure their extension. So in that mid-20th century, in fear of revolution, in fear of the competition that socialism offered to Western societies, the ruling class adopted a policy of concessions. Beginning around 1980, it took it back. But capitalism was trying to adapt, rather. And so anyway, this is the thesis I'm working on, and the nature is hard to prove, but I'm going to keep working at it. Angela made this point in his comments. The achievements that we made, that our country's working class made, had a lot to do with the ideological and political competition coming from the part of the world that was already socialist. So let me conclude with saying that I'm very glad to be at this panel because I think it's the duty of Marxists in the 21st century to defend 20th century socialism and its achievements as honestly and as completely as we can, just as in the early 20th century, honest Marxists defended the achievements of the Paris Commune. We have a similar task, and so this is a work in progress. If anybody's got ideas, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Project which has been carried out by these two organizations here, Marxism-Leninism Today, and that's the website, and also the Party of Communists USA. And there is a table of books out there, out in the passageway. And so the first question would be, what I think I should do would be take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll go, the panelists in the order that they made their presentations can answer if they want to. Greenwich.
Okay.
Then Syracuse.
Okay, 4 quick points. William R. Graves was the general in charge of the U.S. invasion of Russia in 1919, at that point the Soviet Union. And he wrote an autobiography, which you can get online, William R. Graves, in which he said the excuse that he was given that he was going to help the Czechs get out of Russia was false. We were there to crush the revolution, and I urge all of you to read this account. This is the general, the U.S. general appointed to go in there by Wilson. Second point, very quickly. Dewey, John Dewey, was working for the Military Intelligence Bureau at the time. You can read his secret report on the Poles. He was working to split the Polish opposition people between Paderewski and Pilsudski Poles, and it's in the secret report. You can get that online. John Dewey. So much for Dewey. Alexander Worth's, 2 more points as quickly given. Alexander Worth's book, the BBC correspondent to Russia during this Second World War, W-E-R-T-H, wrote a wonderful book, Russia at War, which is, to me, still the best account, as fluid and engaging as Angelo's presentation, and as full of facts as Grover's. The preface talks about how the Soviet Union tried and failed to get an alliance against Hitler, undermined and sabotaged by the English and the French. And finally, Grover, when Grover's command of languages, which is unequal, I think, on the planet, not just in this country, when he did the Katyn examination, he learned Polish just to deal with the sources, already fluent in German, Russian, went to China and spoke to the Chinese, the generals were sitting in the audience about this Khrushchev Lies book. So this is the impact that this fantastic intellectual who I met in the 60s, so I've always been friends with Grover, has had on the, and I did a little piece on global research called The Unraveling of the Anglo-American Imperial Project. I did in 2012, it was immediately published, and it's exactly what's happening today. Thank you.
Mr. Baranovich was candidate for mayor
On the Green Party in 2013 as well as 2005 in New York City.
and Mr. Syracuse, secretary of the Green Party.
After Stalin's death, why did the Soviet leadership discredit Stalin? And was there much opposition from the Soviet people?
Okay, if that's
anybody
the
would
question,
like
then
Take on that question.
the young woman will have a question, and then the panelists can answer in order. Yes.
It's a really elementary, simple question. What would you call Putin's party of today? Like, what would be the, how would you describe the government that Russia has today? It's not communism. So that's my question.
Well, those 3 questions, and then we'll hopefully take care of them, and then we'll have 3 other questions. Greg, do you want to answer?
Well, just the last question, and I'll defer to the others on earlier 2 comments and questions. But I think simply Russia is a capitalist country, and as a capitalist country, it has different political parties, including a communist party. But Putin represents essentially Russian capitalism. And to understand how he reacts to world events, you have to put it in the context of imperialism, world imperialism, and the interest of Russia versus the interest of other countries. And thirdly, then you have to look at the balance of forces among imperialists. I mean, you go back to 1914, Serbia was an imperialist country too. It had its sights on a little chunk of Austro-Hungary. Austro-Hungary had hostilities towards Serbia, and then fire goes off and we have World War I. I think I give credit to Putin for this. That is, he seems to be trying to work for a more peaceful world than the Western imperialists are. And I think that signals the fact that Western imperialism is in deep, profound crisis and in desperate crisis. And their actions are acts of desperation.
Would Putin be called a dictator or a president or?
Well, look, I mean, it's like Assad or anyone else. I mean, by Western standards, it's a democracy. By Western standards, if you use the U.S. as the benchmark of democracy, then it's probably more democratic than the U.S. less corruption in government, less fixing of it. So, I mean, I don't use the word democracy without something affixed to it. Socialist democracy, people's democracy, or bourgeois democracy, and basically Russia's a bourgeois democracy. That means people that have money have inordinate influence, just as they do here. And
Robert, you want to say something on that, or comments or questions?
Well, this gentleman here said, why did, if I understand you correctly, why did Khrushchev attack Stalin?
Well, it wasn't only Khrushchev. Well, I'll repeat the question. Why, after his death, why did the Soviet leadership discredit Stalin? And was there much opposition from the Soviet people?
There was some opposition, but I haven't thoroughly researched. Yes, there was some opposition. There was certainly some opposition. But not much. Why did the Soviet leadership do that? That's a very good question. And of course, the Soviet leadership at that time said, you know, Stalin was this monster. They basically said the kinds of things that the anti-communists said. My first book, called Khrushchev Lied, represents the results of my research into Khrushchev's famous secret speech, which inaugurated this attack on Stalin, right, in 1956. And I found out that everything he said was false. Everything he said was, we can now prove, thanks to the Soviet archive, former Soviet archives mainly, can now prove that it was false. But therefore, his audience most of his audience at that 20th Party Congress had to know that at least some of it was false. I think a few of those people probably knew that most of it was false. But this was the party leadership. None of them directly opposed it. Now, in a few years later, 57, right? Molotov, Malenkov, Kaganovich, Stalin's right-hand men. Then they tried to get Khrushchev out. They tried to, and they were unsuccessful. But they went along with it at the time.
Why?
They went along with it at the time. Out of in Molotov, you know, there's this book, Molotov Remembers. In English, it's called Molotov Remembers. Interviews of Molotov by a guy who knew him pretty well. Molotov is not very very precise on exactly why they went along with all of this stuff. I have some theories, but this is not the time to go into that. The point is, I think that Stalin was very isolated at the time of his death. Most of the leadership didn't agree with him anymore. They pretended to. So I ended up my talk today and also yesterday, and I try to end up at least all my talks with this question. We have to investigate why the system, why the Soviet Union went off the rails. We have to investigate that. And it's my view that in order to investigate that, in order to come to conclusions about why the Soviet Union failed, we have to know what really happened. And all of these lies about Stalin, from Trotsky and from the anti-communists, obscure the question. In fact, they take Khrushchev's line. Khrushchev's line was, the system is fine, everything's fine, except Stalin was bad. And now that we got rid of Stalin, everything's fine again. That was what he said. I think that's ridiculous. Clearly, there were some profound systemic problems in the Soviet Union, going back into at least the 30s and probably further back than that. Now, certainly, Roger Kieran's and Joe Jamison's book, Socialism Betrayed, goes into some of the systemic problems of the later period, the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods, for example. So that they explore systemic issues there. It wasn't just a question of Gorbachev came along and had a bad night one night and decided to hell with socialism and get rid of it. Things don't happen like that. So we need to try to understand what were the contradictions within Soviet socialism that led to its being reversed instead of it developing more and more towards
towards, graduating more and more towards communism, right?
We could,
That's it.
what was
Okay,
it?
yep.
Okay, Angelo, do you want to add something to the?
Just my own little observation very quickly. Again, I use my parents as a barometer because they came before me and they told me stories about World War II and then my own understanding of history, whether it was Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, key point, and Hitler and Mussolini. That period of time in the world, the mindset of people is that they needed a leader, a father figure. I think that has to be understood. We're looking at it through 21st century eyeglasses, which is not the world that existed at that time. My folks told me that when Roosevelt died, and the movie The Way We Were, by the way, The Way We Were, that shows it to you, that the communists, even the communists and the average person in the street, when Roosevelt died, it was like their father died. They had that feeling that he took us through these hard period of times, and now he's gone. How are we going to exist without him? And that was the period in the Soviet Union. That's why the people that cried and were stampeded by, you heard about it, that was not fake. That was real. No, but I'm saying that was, because the American media, they belittle that. That was real. That was real. So this period, it was the Mussolini. If you talk to anybody with an Italian background like me who lived in Italy, they'll tell you the same thing about Mussolini. It's this man, and I think there's that kind of mentality with Trump, that he's going to save us. He's going to make things good. That this thing where the single individual is going to really change things without understanding the whole thing of a class. And that's my understanding of that whole period. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, George, you want to make some, we're going to have another round of questions and comments. I just want to, no, we'll get into that, but first the panelists have answers to those first questions. Now, the next round will be Gus. Yes, you have a question or comment?
Well, I wanted to answer some, not answer, but contribute to the discussion. The economic problems of socialism, written by Stalin, is a struggle. It's an economic, ideological struggle against revisionism. So he knew there was a heavy struggle going on in the party. The other thing I think that has some influence with what the question you asked is that World War II, the Soviet Union took a tremendous toll. You know, and some of the best communists died fighting fascists. You know, so that had to take some toll. 25 million people died in this conflict, in this war. Right? The other thing is that at the same time, imperialism was using the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb also had influence on the revisionists. You know, they actually started to cave in to imperialism, because people say that the atomic bomb that was exploded in Japan, in Nagasaki, Hiroshima, was more as a signal to the Soviet Union.
That's right.
They said this is what was coming down. So I think that those things influenced some of those changes that took place inside the Soviet Union.
Another question or comment? Yes.
Yes, I have a question for Joe Jacobson. I found your thesis about the mid-20th century capitalism being a period of sort of mild social democracy very, very compelling. And my question is, in the end of your presentation, you talked about in the 1980s there was a revanchement, taking back. And perhaps you might want to talk a little bit about that. Why did it happen in the 1980s rather than the 1990s? And particularly how the 1980s affected the American left, because there we did have a decline very precipitous of the left in that period. So that's, if you wanted to talk about that, I'd appreciate that.
Should I answer this or wait?
Well, let's take George's comment or question first, and then the panelists can answer.
Walter had his hand.
George?
Just like a couple of things. First, part of the Party of Communist USA, I've also helped develop Red Star Publishers, and then if you could just maybe put it on the board, it's www.redstarpublishers.org. We have the complete mission of
What was that again? I'm
Moscow.
sorry,
Red Star Publishers with an S, and it's just .org. We have the complete mission to Moscow on there in the downloadable form. We have a whole bunch of other books, including the Mitros United Front Against Fascism, which we have at the table and so forth. I'd just like to comment, it's on a different direction on Greg's point on the question of the United Front and what we can, how it can be used today. Right? I think that the United Front in the pre-World War II period was clearly put forward as a tactical move to bring people who are not ready to go for socialism together against fascism, but never hiding the question of socialism. And I think what happened in a number of parties in the post-war period was, which I think Greg pointed out, was that they left the United Front to just sort of developing a better, more progressive capitalism. I think we need to try and see how we can deal with the question of United Front today when you have, millions of people around the country disgusted with Trump. And if we're not there with a socialist perspective, but not kind of demanding that people agree with us about socialism, we need to be out there so that that movement does not go totally to the Democratic Party, that we have an alternative, which is right now we're fighting for democratic rights, we're fighting against war, we're fighting against Islamophobia, for women's liberation, but our viewpoint is socialism.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the panelists to be brief, and then we're going to go for another round of questions, hopefully, because we only have 13 minutes, but the lady, and then we'll go into the answers.
My 2 cents on the 1930s sort of universal need for a father figure, a kindly father figure. This is like patriarchy writ large, and one of my ideas, undeveloped ideas about fascism is that it reproduces a very strong patriarchal family in a larger society.
Trump. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, the panelists want to make comments or questions, at least that, Joe?
Well, just to.
No, and then we'll answers, and then we'll have 3 more questions.
The brother over here had a question about 1980, what happened in 1980. Normally, the conventional left discourse now is, well, that's when neoliberalism came along. And there are a number of problems with the word neoliberalism. But what I think is so good about the Piketty study that Greg based much of his talk on is that he puts this in a much longer historical perspective. And that what happened in 1980 with Reagan and Thatcher and the spread of similar right-wing governments since then, and the dominance of neoliberalism and its assimilation by the Democratic Party, which previously had a somewhat reformist outlook. What happened in 1980 was capitalism reverting to its normal, true form that it has exhibited over the centuries. So we're getting now levels of inequality that capitalism exhibited in the 19th and 18th centuries. So, if not earlier. So that's what happened. So it's a taking back, it's a reassertion of class power beginning around 1980, which had been, where the ruling circles had bided their time. They made concessions to unions, allowing the creation of social democratic governments, but bided their time until they could reassert power. So that I think is the basic perspective. Why it happened in 1980? Well, the 1970s was a period of turmoil when the old forms of Keynesian management of the economy didn't work, inflation was running high, people were dissatisfied, and the right took advantage of that to get Reagan and Thatcher in. And after that, the rest is history. So that's the basic take on how we should think anew about 20th century history.
If there are any quick answers from the panelists on those questions, offer, and then...
Okay, well, I'll make it quick. I think, to me, it seems that the biggest question facing people of the world, the working class of the world today, is why the magnificent communist movement of the 20th century failed. That's the biggest question. And many of the issues like gentleman talked about Stalin's last work and so forth, the question about Khrushchev's speech. There are many aspects to that question. I think this is the question that we need to ask, and I think that most of the people, out there are looking at us for some answers, right? If we say that communism or the communist movement or socialism is the answer, then we have to figure that out. It's up to us to do that. So let's do it.
Greg, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I want to combine two questions, the one about 1980 and the one about the United Front. I think one answer answers both. We have to step back from these political questions and look at the political economy of that period. And the political economy of that period tells us that capitalism running as a Keynesian phenomena ended in 1972. A massive crisis of capitalism began in that period, 1972, with the oil crisis and what followed. And most importantly, the rate of profit dropped dramatically worldwide. The level of competition between Japan and Germany and other countries that were damaged during the war and were recovering, that level of competition grew enormously. People were misled by that period because they probably went monopoly capital and they thought competition was all over. Competition roared back in the 70s, and it forced the rate of profit down. And as Joe said, that destroyed Keynesianism. Modern social democrats do not accept that. Modern social democrats want to go back to Keynesianism. It is not possible.
That's correct.
Capitalism has moved on. And as far as the United Front tactic goes, it depends on how you assess the moment. If you look at the moment as a moment in which capitalism is the way it was before, this 30 glorious years, then the United Front would not be an answer for that. Socialism is on the agenda. And we need to put it back on the agenda first and foremost. So that doesn't preclude having united fronts or temporary alliances with people at all. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that our job, because we're very tiny as communists and Marxist-Leninists, is to put that socialist goal in the forefront, way ahead of everything else. And not say, well, let's compromise it because we want to get along and stop Trump. No, you're not going to stop Trump.
Right.
Trumpism is a phenomenon that grows out of the crisis of capitalism. It's not an aberration. It grows out of the crisis of capitalism. You only have, if you want to ignore it, hold your breath and something worse will come after it.
Right.
But we've got to put socialism back on that agenda.
Okay, we're gonna have, I think, 3 or 4 more questions. Yeah, every 100%, we keep on watering down the message. We have 3 or 4 more questions. I think we could keep on going till noon because usually we gotta get out 10 minutes before noon, but I think there's a break at noon, so maybe we could take a little bit more time. In any case, 1, 2, Walter, 3, and 4. 1? I think you had a question?
Yeah, you
I'm sorry, you had a question.
By the way, there's no break at noon.
There's no break at noon?
Yeah, it's after session 2.
Oh, so we gotta be quick.
So I think we need to get out quick.
Nobody's at
I'm
the
going to
door.
start with the thing that came up from the discussion before about the father figure in like Stalin or whoever, or Roosevelt, that dies and the people go nuts. They don't know what to do. They lose everything. I mean, is this the right attitude for a revolutionary, for a communist? For people that wants to change the world, this is one question. As far as I remember from the class struggle in France by Marx, he says in there that the proletariat has to face these kinds of leaders, dictators, whatever they are, and he has to defeat them again and again and again in order to move history forward. We have similar examples in other revolutions, like the French Revolution, where you had the French Revolution and then you had Napoleon. And we don't want to see these things happening again and again. So, and the main question, the conclusive question is that in what way the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, managed to educate the people to make like Lenin said that the civil cook has to be able to take care of the state affairs. That's it.
Novak.
Okay, I'll be really quick. Following up on comrades' comments here, obviously, well-meaning people talk about, hey, let's bring back Keynesianism or these social democratic band-aids that aren't going to work, like a basic income. The amount of struggle that would be taken against the teeth of what we're up against in capitalism would be so immense. Why don't we just go for the whole damn thing instead of with these social democratic band-aids? I think we need to just tell people this stuff isn't going to work. The amount of, if we're going to put in that much effort to get that, why don't we just go to the root of the problem and get rid of capitalism?
Yeah.
That's right.
Walter.
Yeah, this graph that Joe has, which I think is indicative of Piketty as well. This is obvious, in terms of the growth of the labor movement in the mid-50s. But what's not said is that it was a pro-capitalist labor movement in the mid-50s, firmly committed to capitalism, to helping capitalists, U.S. capitalism, even though, so there was no questioning of the system. So it's not a matter of just the growth, as an indication. It's that there was no, in the labor movement, when you look for people that can contest the system, to challenge the system, that view, capitalism as an aversion, something you want to overthrow, that didn't exist in this situation. Just like Piketty, he describes a situation but doesn't, offer any solution. It's like a statistical anomaly. Well, inequality in the mid-50s, to the 70s decreased. Yeah, but what? The question is why and what does it mean? Capitalism didn't. Its effect on the Soviet, the Soviets' effect on it is true, but you had coming out of the Second World War, it said the hydrogen bomb, the atom bomb, and U.S. preparing for war against the Soviets. Clearly, that was especially with the overthrow of Roosevelt and installation of Truman. That's all.
Yeah, I just have two little observations on what I thought was a wonderful discussion on a number of subjects, and try to focus on the Soviet legacy. And one of the things I would conceptually do going into it is separate the question of Stalin from the question of Soviet history, let's say 1928 to 1952 or whatever, coincides with Stalin's alleged hegemony in the party. I think that Stalin can become a far more problematic and complex issue once it's separated out. And now, looking at that, tends to obscure what the party and the historical process during that time looked like as a totality. Stalin may very well have played both a positive and a negative role throughout that period, and he can be separated out from events of the time, mistakes of the time, triumphs of the time. The other thing is, I think we have to have a clearer idea as to when the Cold War was won by the capitalists. And that's why I would not use the date of 1980, I would use Nixon going to China. I think that the final strategic split of the possible communist camp that occurred there emboldened the capitalists, and that is when you will see the beginning of their revanchism and their counteroffensive against some kind of class collaboration with the Social Democrats.
Gus, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just want to raise the question, United Front Against Fascism. Right now, there's all kinds of definitions going around of what fascism is. And Democracy Now! Had experts on this, and they don't touch. And I think that's something that we need to define, from the Marxist-Leninist point of view. And Dimitri did an analysis, of course, Stalin too, did an analysis of what is fascism. And I think we have to make that available to the conditions today.
We're going to give the panelists 1 minute, one final minute, since we're really tight on time. But one last comment or question from anybody in the public?
Can I make an announcement?
Yes.
Across the hall, right after this, panel commemorating 150th anniversary of Das Kapital. And there'll be a very fabulous speaker from India, who's head of a party there, very interesting guy.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, then one last round.
Okay, about this great man thing having to do with Stalin, I urge you to read my book, Khrushchev Lied. The very first section of it is all about the whole, how Stalin opposed the cult of the individual consistently throughout his life. How it was thrust upon him, forced upon him despite his own desires. Malenkov, within a few weeks of Stalin's death, said, we have to stop this cult of personality around Comrade Stalin. Comrade Stalin also always told us that this was wrong. We should not do this, and we never had the courage to listen to him. So there's a lot about the Stalin period which is very important, and I just wanted to mention this. The cult of personality was really a kind of tool of what you might call the revisionists, the anti-communists, all right, to hide behind, and we need to do more work, but please, take a look at the first section of my book, Khrushchev Lied. It goes into this in detail.
And the books are out there on the table. Greg.
Yeah, just regarding the graph, I think the graph actually explains the pro-capitalist labor movement, because if you take a pro-capitalist labor movement today, it gets nothing. It gets nothing. UAW, for example, workers are working at $15 an hour, startup, or they were a year ago. So a pro-capitalist labor movement doesn't produce any kind of golden era at all. So then you go back and look at that period and say, well, how could a pro-capitalist labor movement do it? Because it was a contract, basically a contract between capitalism and that corrupted labor movement. They got into power through their corruption. They collaborated on USAID, on all the imperialism. And it's actually embarrassing to read that stuff again about a labor movement acted during that period in terms of aiding and abetting imperialism. So I think the graph kind of shows that had to be going on. That had to be the explanation for it.
Okay, Joe Jameson from Marxism-Leninism Today, and in fact, Joe is also an anti-war activist and a labor activist out in Queens. Joe, and then George, if you want to say a minute, being that for the Party of Communist Angelo left, just to sum up, Joe.
The purpose of the graph showing union density in the mid-century is simply to show what capitalism was willing to tolerate. The ferocious resistance that we get now, and which existed prior to 1917, when union density rates were 11 or 3 or 4 or 9. I didn't have a chance to put them on the chart. Reflected the normal attitude of capitalism toward unions. And and it's also true, as Walter pointed out, that the purges of the CIO, beginning around 1946, 7, and continuing for another 12 or 13 years, and reduced the effectiveness, and that's when those political factors governed when the initial decline started to set in, and the leadership became obviously pro-capitalist. So I don't want to claim too much for that chart. It's simply a gross indicator of the degree of capitalist willingness to make concessions. And it's the best one I could find on short notice. I'm searching for other ones.
George, 1 minute.
Yeah, very simply, this panel was, again, a collaboration between two Marxist-Leninist groups. It shows that we have the possibility of working together. Sometimes we have some disagreements, secondary or whatever, but we need to continue doing this. We're planning also to have a larger celebration of the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution. As we get towards October, we want to bring in more forces that consider themselves Marxist-Leninists, but also to see how we can work together on practical day-to-day issues that are important to the working class and the movement as a whole.
Good kiss, warm embrace, thank you everybody. Thanks for coming in.